7 o'clock on a Saturday morning in mid-June, and Marcus Blackwell stood in the parking lot of the Pinnacle Grand Hotel, watching a woman he'd never seen before sprint toward him across the asphalt. She wore the black and white uniform of hotel staff, her name tag catching the early sunlight as she closed the distance between them. Her hand shot out and gripped his forearm with a desperation that made his security detail tense and reach for their radios. "If you want to know who you're really marrying, hide in the trunk right now." The words came out in a rush, breathless and urgent, and Marcus found himself staring into the face of someone who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, her fingers trembled against the fabric of his suit jacket. Behind him, his lead security officer stepped forward with one hand raised, ready to intervene, but something in the woman's expression made Marcus lift his own hand in a gesture that meant, "Wait." "Who are you?" The question came out sharper than he intended, but he'd spent too many years building an empire worth $2.4 billion to ignore his instincts. And right now, every instinct he possessed told him this moment mattered more than he could understand. The woman released his arm and stepped back, her hands still shaking as she pressed them together in front of her chest. "My name is Lorraine Hayes. I'm the head supervisor for the VIP floor. I've worked here 17 years, and I know what I'm about to tell you sounds insane, but you need to listen." Marcus glanced at his watch. 5 hours until the ceremony, 500 guests already gathering from across the country, 4 television networks setting up cameras inside the grand ballroom. Amanda would be upstairs right now, surrounded by stylists and makeup artists, and the quiet anticipation of a bride on her wedding day. Everything he'd planned for, everything he'd allowed himself to hope for after 2 years of careful courtship, hung in the balance of whatever this woman was about to say. "I'm listening." Lorraine's eyes darted toward the hotel entrance, then back to Marcus. Her voice dropped lower, forcing him to lean in to hear. 5 years ago, my brother Jerome died. He was 34 years old, a certified public accountant with a wife and a baby on the way. A woman came into his life who called herself Victoria Lang. She told him she wanted to invest in his business. She was beautiful and sophisticated, and she made him believe she saw something special in him. Within 3 months, she'd convinced him to open joint bank accounts. Within 6 months, $3.2 million moved through those accounts and disappeared into shell companies he didn't even know existed. The morning air felt suddenly colder against Marcus's skin. His security team had closed ranks around him, creating a loose perimeter that gave them privacy while keeping watch on the parking lot's various entrances. Above them, the windows of the Pinnacle Grand reflected the Chicago skyline in columns of gold and glass. The FBI investigated Jerome. They didn't believe him when he said he'd been set up. His wife left him, his reputation was destroyed, his clients abandoned him. And on February 14th, 2019, I found my brother's body in our mother's garage, with the car engine still running. Marcus felt his chest constrict. The story was tragic, devastating, but he couldn't see the connection to his own life, to Amanda, to the woman who'd spent 2 years showing him what love could look like when it wasn't transactional. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hayes, but I don't understand what this has to do with—" "Amanda Sterling," Lorraine cut him off, and the name hung between them like a blade. "The woman you're marrying in 5 hours. I've been working her suite for the past month, preparing for your honeymoon reservation. And I've seen things that make me certain she's running the exact same operation that killed my brother." The words should have sounded absurd. They should have triggered immediate dismissal, a call to security, maybe even a conversation with hotel management about the mental stability of their employees. Instead, Marcus found himself thinking about small inconsistencies that had nagged at him over the past 2 years. The way Amanda always changed the subject when he asked about her family. How she'd claimed her Yale architecture degree, but never appeared in any of the university's alumni databases he'd quietly checked. The fact that every single friend from her supposed past had somehow moved away or lost touch or become unavailable for even the most casual introduction. "What did you see?" Lorraine reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out her phone. Her hands had stopped shaking now, replaced by the steady determination of someone who'd made peace with a difficult decision. 3 weeks ago, I was cleaning the corridor outside the presidential suite when I heard Amanda on the phone. She was speaking English, but her voice was completely different from the way she talks to you. Cold. Calculating. She said, "Everything is set. After the wedding, we'll have full access." Then she laughed and said, 2 years of this exhausting performance, and we're finally at the finish line. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Marcus grabbed the hood of the nearest car to steady himself, his $2,000 suit jacket creasing against the metal. His security detail exchanged glances, but held their positions. That could have been about anything. A business deal, a friend's situation. You can't. There's more. Lorraine swiped through her phone and turned the screen toward him. The image showed a man entering the presidential suite, his face partially obscured by the angle, but his body language unmistakable. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., 4 nights ago. This man has visited Amanda's room 6 times in the past 3 weeks. Always late at night, always when you weren't here. The way he holds her when they embrace isn't professional, it isn't friendly. It's intimate. Marcus took the phone from her hands and zoomed in on the image. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, tall and well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice. He was touching Amanda's shoulder as they stood in the doorway, and even through the graininess of the surveillance photo, Marcus could see the familiarity between them. "Who is he?" "I don't know his name, but 2 days ago, I found a folder that had fallen behind a service card on the VIP floor." Lorraine swiped to another image on her phone. This one showed documents spread across what looked like a hotel bed. Marcus's own face stared back at him from multiple photographs. His properties were listed in neat columns. His charitable foundation's account numbers had been highlighted in yellow marker, and at the top of one page, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Joint account activation, post-marriage." The sun had climbed higher now, and the parking lot was starting to fill with early arrivals. A catering truck pulled up to the service entrance. Someone was unloading flowers from a refrigerated van. The ordinary machinery of an extraordinary day ground forward, while Marcus stood frozen, staring at evidence that his life was about to be destroyed by someone he'd trusted completely. I spent 5 years after Jerome's death teaching myself about financial fraud. I read every case study I could find. I learned to recognize the patterns. Romance scams, investment fraud, identity theft, money laundering through shell companies in states with loose incorporation laws. Lorraine's voice had taken on the quality of someone reciting hard-won knowledge. When I saw these documents, when I heard that phone call, every alarm bell I'd spent half a decade developing started ringing at once. Marcus handed the phone back to her and forced himself to take a slow breath. His mind was racing through possibilities, through explanations, through the careful architecture of everything he'd built with Amanda over the past 24 months. They'd met at the Museum of Contemporary Art. She hadn't known who he was. She'd been studying a painting he'd just purchased, and when he'd approached her, she'd offered an honest critique that suggested genuine knowledge rather than practiced flattery. That moment had felt like fate. It had felt like the universe finally offering him something real after decades of relationships poisoned by his wealth. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" The question came out harder than he'd intended, years of suspicion sharpening his tone despite the evidence mounting in front of him. Lorraine met his gaze without flinching. "I want nothing from you, Mr. Blackwell. I don't want money. I don't want recognition. I don't want anything except to stop what happened to Jerome from happening to someone else." Her voice cracked slightly on her brother's name. When Jerome was drowning in accusations and debt, when he was begging people to believe him, I stood by and watched because I didn't know how to help. I didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. I found him in that garage, and I've had to live every single day since knowing I could have done more. Marcus understood that particular brand of guilt. He'd felt it when his mother died, when the cancer took her before he'd made enough money to afford the treatments that might have saved her. He'd felt it during his first marriage, when Diane had looked at him with contempt and said she couldn't live with a man who had nothing, and he'd been too broken to fight for something that was already dead. Amanda leaves the hotel at 8 o'clock to get ready at the venue. Her car is parked in Section B, third row from the entrance. It's a white Mercedes sedan. Lorraine's words came faster now, as if she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't get them all out. She never locks the trunk. I've watched her come and go for weeks, and she never once checks it. If you want to know who she really is, if you want to see the truth before you sign your life over to her, get in that trunk and let her take you wherever she's really going. The suggestion was insane. He was a billionaire. He had resources. He had investigators. He could make phone calls and have Amanda's entire life history laid out in front of him within hours. Hiding in a car trunk like some character from a second-rate thriller made no logical sense. But logic hadn't saved Jerome Hayes. Logic hadn't protected any of the other victims Lorraine was implicitly referencing when she talked about patterns and case studies. Sometimes the direct approach was the only one that worked. "Show me the car." Lorraine led him through the parking lot, past rows of luxury vehicles that belonged to guests already checked in for the wedding. His security detail followed at a discreet distance, their radios silent but their attention sharp. They'd worked for Marcus long enough to know when to ask questions and when to simply execute whatever plan he'd committed to, no matter how unusual it seemed. The Mercedes sat exactly where Lorraine had described, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. It was a recent model, elegant and expensive, but not ostentatious. Exactly the kind of car someone like Amanda would drive. Exactly the kind of choice that suggested taste without pretension. Marcus walked around the vehicle once, his mind still cataloging reasons why this was a terrible idea. His phone buzzed in his pocket with incoming messages from his assistant, from the wedding planner, from guests confirming their arrival times. The world kept moving forward even as he stood at the edge of a decision that might change everything. "The ceremony starts at 2 o'clock. You'll be back in plenty of time." Lorraine stood beside the trunk, her hand resting on the smooth metal. "But if I'm right, if what I've seen and heard adds up to what I think it does, then you need to know before you walk down that aisle. You need to see who she really is when she thinks no one's watching." Marcus looked back at the hotel. Somewhere up on the 23rd floor, Amanda was probably sipping coffee and laughing with her bridesmaids, none of whom he'd met before yesterday because they'd all supposedly flown in from different cities where Amanda had lived during her mysteriously fragmented past. She'd explained away every inconsistency with stories that made sense in isolation but formed a troubling pattern when examined together. He thought about his mother, Grace Blackwell, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and clothed, who'd died believing her son would find happiness someday. He thought about the promise he'd made at her grave that he'd never let anyone use him, never let money become more important than truth. "Open it!" Lorraine pressed the trunk release button on the handle, and the lid lifted with a quiet hydraulic hiss. The interior was clean and spacious, lined with carpet that looked recently vacuumed. There was an emergency release handle glowing faintly near the latch mechanism. Marcus could see a spare tire compartment, a first aid kit, and nothing else suspicious. He turned to his security detail. "I need 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Don't follow me. Don't track my phone. Wait here and make sure no one questions why I'm not in my suite getting ready." The lead officer opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again when Marcus fixed him with a look that had ended countless boardroom arguments. "Sir, if you're in danger, I'll be fine. If Miss Hayes is wrong, I'll be back shortly, and we'll all have a story to laugh about later. If she's right, then I need to see it for myself. No interference, no backup plan. Just trust me." The trunk was less comfortable than Marcus had anticipated. He folded himself into the space with his knees drawn up against his chest, his expensive suit creasing in ways his tailor would have found horrifying. The carpet smelled faintly of cleaning solution and new car scent. Lorraine looked down at him with an expression that mixed sympathy and determination. "Mr. Blackwell, I'll be here when you get back. Whatever you find, whatever you see, You won't be alone in dealing with it." Then she closed the trunk, and the world went dark. Marcus lay in absolute blackness, listening to his own breathing echo in the confined space. His phone was digging into his hip through his pocket, his shoulder pressed against something hard that might have been the spare tire well. This was absurd. This was paranoid. This was the kind of behavior that would make headlines if anyone ever found out a billionaire had hidden in a car trunk based on the word of a hotel employee he'd met 15 minutes ago. But Jerome Hayes had ignored his instincts, and Jerome Hayes was dead. The minutes crawled past. Marcus counted seconds in his head, then gave up when he lost track somewhere around 300. His back started to ache. His left foot fell asleep. The trunk smelled increasingly like expensive cologne and fear sweat, which probably said something unflattering about his state of mind. At 8:17, according to the glowing numbers on his watch, the car doors opened and closed. The familiar scent of jasmine and vanilla perfume drifted back into the trunk space through some gap in the rear seat. Amanda hummed quietly to herself as she adjusted the driver's seat, as she connected her phone to the car's Bluetooth system, as she went through the ordinary motions of someone about to drive somewhere unremarkable on an unremarkable morning. The engine started. The car moved. Marcus pressed his hand against the emergency release handle, reminding himself that he could end this at any moment. He could pop the trunk, stand up, demand explanations. The fact that he didn't spoke to the small, insistent voice in the back of his mind that had been whispering warnings for months and that he'd been too hopeful to acknowledge. The first few minutes of the drive were silent, except for the hum of tires on asphalt and Amanda's occasional humming. She was singing along to something playing through the speakers, her voice light and cheerful. It was a sound Marcus knew well, had loved during their countless drives together, during lazy Sunday mornings when she'd made breakfast and sang along to whatever was playing on the kitchen radio. Then her phone rang. "David, I'm on my way." The name meant nothing to Marcus. Amanda had never mentioned anyone named David. In 2 years of dating, he'd memorized the handful of names she'd referenced from her past, and David had never been among them. "Don't worry. After today, everything will be finalized. 2 years of this exhausting performance, and we're finally at the finish line." The temperature in the trunk seemed to drop 20 degrees. Marcus felt his hands go numb. His lungs forgot how to process air properly. Those words, delivered in Amanda's voice but stripped of all the warmth and affection he'd come to associate with her. Had she been looking at surveillance photos of him for weeks before that encounter? Had she memorized his schedule, his habits, his favorite places? The night he'd confessed his fear that no one would ever love him for himself. The night she'd cried and told him she'd fallen in love with him before she knew about his money. Had those tears been practiced? Had that vulnerability been calculated? The joint accounts will be activated the moment the marriage is official. Then we transfer everything through the Delaware and Nevada shell companies. By the time anyone realizes what happened, we'll be gone with new identities. The foundation accounts are already compromised, so even if he tries to fight back, the FBI will be investigating him for money laundering within days. She paused to listen to whatever David was saying. "I know, baby. I miss you too. Sophie has been asking about me constantly. Tell her mommy will be home soon, and then we can all be together again. No more pretending, no more fake smiles. Just us." Sophie. The name detonated in Marcus's consciousness like a bomb. Amanda had told him she was an only child. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. She had no siblings, no extended family, no one in the world who mattered to her except the future they were building together. That had been the story she'd woven so carefully, the narrative that had made him feel like the hero of her recovery, the man who'd helped her believe in family again. But there was a Sophie, and there was a David, and somewhere out there, Amanda had a whole other life that didn't include him at all. The car drove for another 30 minutes while Marcus lay in the darkness, listening to Amanda make plans for their disappearance. She talked about timing, about which accounts to hit first, about the order of transfers that would minimize detection. She spoke with the casual expertise of someone who'd done this many times before, who'd refined the process through repetition and experience. When she finally ended the call, the silence felt worse than her words had. Marcus could hear her breathing, could imagine her smiling in the driver's seat, pleased with herself for pulling off another successful con. He wanted to throw up. He wanted to scream. He wanted to be anywhere except curled up in this trunk, his faith in humanity deteriorating with every passing second. The car made several turns, then slowed and stopped. The engine cut off. The driver's door opened and closed. Marcus waited, counting to 30 before he reached for the emergency release. The trunk popped open and daylight flooded in, momentarily blinding him. He blinked against the brightness, his eyes adjusting slowly to reveal a residential neighborhood. Large homes set back from the street on manicured lawns, mature trees providing shade, the kind of area where families lived in comfortable anonymity, where wealth was present, but not flaunted. Amanda was already walking toward a 3-story townhouse with ivy climbing its brick facade. Marcus pulled himself out of the trunk, his muscles protesting after 45 minutes of cramped confinement. He felt exposed standing in broad daylight on an unfamiliar street, but no one was around to see him. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular way that suggested everyone was at work or school or otherwise occupied with their Saturday morning routines. He followed Amanda's path at a distance, staying behind parked cars and mailboxes like some kind of amateur detective in a movie. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him, but the alternative was pretending nothing was wrong. And that ship had sailed the moment Lorraine Hayes had grabbed his arm in the hotel parking lot. Amanda reached the townhouse and opened the door without knocking. She disappeared inside, and Marcus found himself standing at the edge of the property, staring at a life he'd known nothing about. Through a ground-floor window, he could see into what looked like a living room. Comfortable furniture arranged around a television, children's toys scattered on the carpet, photographs on the mantel that were too far away to make out clearly, but that spoke to domesticity and permanence. Then a man appeared. Tall, dark-haired, probably early 40s. He wore casual clothes and moved with the ease of someone in his own home. When Amanda walked into the room, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. He crossed the space in 3 strides and wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off the ground as they embraced. This was David. This was the other life. This was everything Marcus had been told didn't exist. A child's voice called out from somewhere deeper in the house, high-pitched and excited. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, came running into the living room. She wore pink pajamas decorated with cartoon characters. Her hair was tangled from sleep. She launched herself at Amanda with the unself-conscious joy of a child greeting a parent after separation. "Mommy, you came back!" Amanda caught the little girl and spun her around, laughing with an authenticity Marcus had never seen on her face before. This wasn't performance. This wasn't calculation. This was real love, real connection, the kind of unguarded emotion that Amanda had spent 2 years pretending to feel for him while reserving the genuine article for people he'd never known existed. Sophie. This was Sophie. Marcus stood frozen at the window, watching the family scene unfold in front of him like a nightmare given form. David said something that made Amanda laugh. Sophie was chattering about something that had happened at school. The 3 of them moved together with the practiced coordination of people who'd been a unit for years, who knew each other's rhythms and habits and moods. On the coffee table, Marcus could see documents spread out. Even from outside, even through glass and distance, he recognized his own face in the photographs, his properties listed and analyzed, his foundation's accounts mapped out with a kind of detail that suggested months of research and planning. There were other photographs too, other men, other targets, a list of names with dollar amounts written beside them. 12 names that Marcus could count, and probably more on pages he couldn't see. This wasn't Amanda's first time. This wasn't even David's first time. How much had they stolen before him? How many men had stood where Marcus was standing now, watching the woman they loved reveal herself as nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance. How many of them had fought back, and how many had simply disappeared into shame and bankruptcy, and the kind of despair that had driven Jerome Hayes to fill a garage with carbon monoxide. Marcus pulled away from the window and stumbled back toward the street. His legs felt weak. His hands were shaking. He'd built an empire from nothing, had faced down hostile takeovers and market crashes and every kind of business adversity imaginable, and none of it had prepared him for this particular flavor of betrayal. He flagged down a taxi 3 blocks away, gave the driver the address of the Pinnacle Grand, and sat in the back seat staring at nothing while Chicago flowed past the windows. The driver tried to make small talk about the weather, about traffic, about the Cubs' chances this season, and eventually gave up when Marcus didn't respond beyond occasional grunts. His phone had been buzzing steadily for the past hour. Messages from his assistant asking about timeline confirmations. Messages from the wedding planner requesting his approval on last-minute seating arrangements. Messages from guests who'd arrived and wanted to know where to send gifts. The machinery of the wedding ground forward without him, everyone assuming he was busy with groom preparation and final details. No one suspected he'd just spent the past 90 minutes hidden in a car trunk, watching his fiancée's real life play out in a house he'd never known existed. The taxi pulled up to the Pinnacle Grand at 9:15. Marcus paid the driver with cash from his wallet, over-tipping by several 100% because his hands were too unsteady to count properly, and because nothing about money seemed to matter anymore. What was $100 when he'd almost lost $2.4 billion? What was anything when the woman he'd been about to marry had spent 2 years studying him like a lab specimen, identifying his weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision? Lorraine was waiting where she'd promised to be, standing near the entrance to the parking garage. When she saw Marcus emerge from the taxi, her expression shifted from anxious hope to something that looked like grief. "You found it." Not a question, a statement of fact based on whatever she saw on his face. Marcus nodded because he didn't trust his voice. Lorraine guided him away from the main entrance, through a service corridor that hotel guests never saw, into a small office that appeared to be used for staff meetings. She closed the door and gestured toward a chair. Marcus sat because the alternative was falling down. "Tell me what you saw." So he told her about the phone call, about David and Sophie, about the townhouse in Lincoln Park and the family he'd never known existed, about the documents spread across the coffee table that mapped out his destruction with a kind of detail that suggested months of planning, about watching Amanda hold her daughter with genuine love while reserving nothing but carefully calculated performance for the man she was scheduled to marry in less than 5 hours. Lorraine listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with each detail. When Marcus finished, she pulled out her phone and placed it on the table between them. "There's more you need to know. Things I found but didn't have time to show you in the parking lot." She pulled up a series of photographs that showed documents more clearly than the ones Marcus had glimpsed through the Lincoln Park window. The Blackwell Foundation has been compromised. Over the past 6 months, donations have been redirected through shell companies in Delaware and Nevada. Small amounts at first, then gradually increasing. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate audits, but substantial enough that by the time anyone notices, you'll be the primary suspect. Marcus stared at the evidence of his own incoming destruction. Amanda hadn't just been planning to steal his personal wealth. She'd been setting him up to take the fall for money laundering, for fraud, for every crime she was actually committing. When the FBI eventually investigated, which they inevitably would once the missing money was discovered, all trails would lead back to Marcus Blackwell. His signature on the joint accounts, his foundation being used as a pass-through for illegal transfers, his marriage to a woman who would conveniently disappear right around the time the investigation heated up. He'd be ruined. Not just financially, though that would be catastrophic enough. His reputation would be destroyed. His name would become synonymous with fraud and corruption. Every legitimate business deal he'd ever made would be re-examined through the lens of suspicion. The charitable work he'd spent years building would collapse as donors fled to protect their own reputations. And somewhere, Amanda and David and Sophie would be living comfortably on money stolen from Marcus and 11 other men who'd made the mistake of believing in love. My brother never recovered from what Victoria Lang did to him. Lorraine's voice was quiet but steady. The FBI investigation destroyed his career. His wife left him and took their daughter. Jerome spent 18 months trying to prove his innocence, and when he finally realized no one would ever believe him, he gave up. I found him in our mother's garage on Valentine's Day, which I'm sure Victoria thought was hilarious in some twisted way. Marcus looked at the woman across from him, this stranger who'd risked her job and possibly her safety to warn someone she didn't know. Why are you doing this? You could get fired. Amanda will know you're the one who told me. She'll come after you. Let her try. Lorraine's expression hardened. I've spent 5 years wishing I'd been brave enough to do something when Jerome first showed me signs that something was wrong. I watched him spiral and told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I believed him when he said everything would work out, that the truth would come to light eventually. I was wrong, and it cost him everything. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Marcus's. You have resources my brother didn't have. You have money and lawyers and connections. You can fight back in ways Jerome never could. But only if you know what you're fighting against before it's too late. Only if you're willing to see the truth, even when it destroys everything you hoped was real. Marcus thought about his mother, who'd spent her life cleaning houses for wealthy families who barely acknowledged her existence, who'd pressed their shirts and polished their silver and come home exhausted every night to a son she was determined to see succeed. Grace Blackwell had taught him that poverty was circumstantial, not destiny, that hard work and integrity mattered more than the accidents of birth. But she'd also taught him to recognize when someone was using him, to understand the difference between respect and exploitation, to know his worth beyond the dollar amount attached to his name. What do I do? The question came out hollow. Marcus had built a fortune by always knowing the next move, by seeing 3 steps ahead of his competition. Now he sat in a hotel storage room asking a stranger for guidance because his own judgment had failed him so completely. You call the FBI. Lorraine pulled out a business card from her pocket. The name Catherine Morrison was printed above a phone number with a Chicago area code. I took the liberty of doing some research after I found those documents. Special Agent Morrison works in the Financial Crimes Division. She's been investigating fraud cases for 15 years. I called her yesterday and explained what I'd seen. She's waiting to hear from you. Marcus took the card, the paper feeling impossibly light for something that carried so much weight. One phone call would set events in motion that couldn't be stopped. One decision would transform his wedding day into a crime scene, his bride into a defendant, his entire life into evidence. The alternative was going through with the ceremony, saying vows he now knew were built on lies, signing legal documents that would give Amanda access to everything he'd spent his life building, walking into his own destruction with eyes wide open because he was too proud or too foolish or too desperate to admit he'd been wrong. If I call Agent Morrison, what happens? She investigates, she gathers evidence, she builds a case, and when she has enough to make charges stick, she arrests Amanda and David and whoever else is involved in this operation. Lorraine's voice was matter-of-fact, laying out the process without embellishment. She also protects you, makes sure the investigation focuses on the right people, ensures that when the financial records are examined, it's clear you were the victim, not the perpetrator. Marcus looked at his watch. 4.5 hours until the ceremony. Guests were probably already checking into their rooms. The catering staff would be setting up. Flowers were being arranged. A string quartet was doing sound checks, the ordinary machinery of a wedding grinding forward, while the groom sat in a storage room, contemplating the destruction of everything he'd thought he was building. His phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Can't wait to marry you. See you at the altar. I love you. 3 lies in 3 sentences. The efficiency was almost impressive. Marcus dialed the number on Catherine Morrison's card. She answered on the second ring. Special Agent Morrison? Her voice was crisp and professional, the tone of someone accustomed to emergency calls. My name is Marcus Blackwell. I believe my fiancé is planning to defraud me of several $billion, and my wedding is scheduled to begin in 4.5 hours. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Mr. Blackwell, I've been hoping you'd call. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't contact Amanda Sterling. Don't tell anyone else what you've learned. I'm sending a team to your location now, and we're going to fix this before it's too late. Catherine Morrison arrived at the Pinnacle Grand 40 minutes later with 3 other agents dressed in business casual attire that would blend seamlessly with wedding guests. She was 39 years old, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single glance, and when she shook Marcus's hand, her grip conveyed both competence and urgency. We've been tracking Sarah Mitchell for 8 months. That's her real name. Amanda Sterling is an identity she constructed specifically for this operation. Catherine spread a series of files across the storage room table, each one marked with dates and locations. In October of last year, a real estate developer in Boston filed a complaint after losing $4 million to a woman matching Amanda's description. He withdrew the complaint 3 weeks later, presumably because she convinced him the scandal would destroy what was left of his reputation. Marcus stared at the files, each one representing another man who'd fallen for the same performance. Another victim who'd believed himself special enough, loved enough, chosen enough to be the exception to whatever rules governed human deception. How many others have there been? Catherine's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been sympathy. 14 confirmed cases over the past 12 years. We suspect there are more who never came forward. The pattern is consistent. Sarah and her husband David identify wealthy men who are recently divorced, widowed, or otherwise vulnerable to romantic manipulation. They research their targets for months before initial contact. The meetings always appear coincidental. Museums, charity events, coffee shops, anywhere that allows for organic conversation. She pulled out a photograph of David Mitchell. He looked slightly different from the man Marcus had seen through the window, but the resemblance was unmistakable. David handles the technical side: identity fabrication, shell company establishment, money movement. Sarah handles the emotional manipulation. Together, they've stolen an estimated $52 million, and we've only been able to prove a fraction of it because their victims either refuse to testify or become implicated in the money laundering schemes themselves. Lorraine stood against the wall with her arms crossed, watching the federal agents transform the storage room into a makeshift command center. She'd been right about everything, and the vindication seemed to bring her no pleasure. Marcus understood that feeling. Being right about betrayal was its own special kind of loss. 3 of their previous targets died by suicide. Catherine's voice remained steady as she delivered this information, but the weight of it hung in the air like smoke. We can't prove causation, but the pattern suggests Sarah and David deliberately push their victims toward financial ruin that triggers criminal investigation. The shame, the isolation, the legal consequences, all compound until some people see no way out. Jerome Hayes had been one of those people. Marcus thought about Lorraine finding her brother in that garage, about the years she'd spent educating herself on financial crimes while grief burned through her like acid. She'd turned her pain into expertise, and her expertise into intervention, and she'd saved Marcus from becoming another statistic in Catherine Morrison's case files. What happens now? Marcus checked his watch again. 3 hours and 40 minutes until ceremony time. His assistant would be panicking soon if he didn't return to his suite to begin formal preparations. Catherine gestured to one of her colleagues, a younger agent with the kind of precise bearing that suggested military background. Agent Williams is going to wire you for audio. We need you to go through with preparations as if nothing has changed. Act normally. Let Amanda believe everything is proceeding according to her plan. The more natural you appear, the less likely she'll suspect we're closing in. The idea of seeing Amanda again, of pretending the past 90 minutes hadn't shattered every assumption he'd built his future on, made Marcus's stomach clench. But the alternative was letting her walk away, letting her and David and whoever else was involved in this operation move on to victim number 15. Let them find another lonely man desperate enough for connection that he'd ignore warning signs until it was too late. "You want me to marry her?" The words tasted like poison. "No." Catherine's response was immediate and firm. "We want you to start the ceremony. We want you to stand at that altar with 600 people watching and cameras recording. And then, at exactly the right moment, we want you to tell the truth. Publicly. Completely. In a way that makes it impossible for Sarah Mitchell to disappear into another identity somewhere else." Marcus understood what she was asking. Public humiliation. Personal exposure. The transformation of his wedding into a spectacle that would be replayed on news channels and social media for weeks. Every private moment of his manipulation would become entertainment for millions of strangers who'd analyze his gullibility and question his intelligence. But it would also prevent Sarah from destroying anyone else. It would put her face and her methods on every screen in America. It would make her too recognizable to pull off another long-term con, at least not without significant plastic surgery and a level of caution that would make the work much harder. "I'll do it." Marcus heard the words come out of his mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it." Catherine nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "We'll have agents positioned throughout the venue. When you're ready to expose Sarah, simply remove your boutonniere and place it on the altar. That will be our signal to move in and make the arrest. Until then, you need to be the happy groom. You need to sell the performance as well as she's been selling hers." Agent Williams produced recording equipment from a briefcase that looked like it cost more than most cars. The wire was smaller than Marcus expected, barely thicker than a strand of hair, with a transmitter the size of a button that would attach to the inside of his vest. The technology was designed to be undetectable even during the kind of close contact that wedding celebrations involved. "We'll be monitoring everything in real time." Williams worked with practiced efficiency, positioning the wire and testing audio levels. "If at any point you feel unsafe, if Sarah or David do anything that suggests they figured out we're involved, say the phrase, 'I need some air,' and we'll extract you immediately." Marcus stood still while they prepared him, feeling like he was being fitted for armor rather than surveillance equipment. In a way, he supposed he was. This wire was the only protection he had against an enemy who'd been living inside his defenses for 2 years, who knew his vulnerabilities better than he knew them himself. When they finished, Catherine handed him a phone that looked identical to his own device, but was apparently loaded with law enforcement software that would track every communication, record every call, document every text message that might serve as evidence. "Your regular phone is now evidence. Use this one instead. Amanda won't notice the difference, and we'll be monitoring everything." Catherine's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional facade. "I know this is difficult, Mr. Blackwell. I know it feels like betrayal compounded by more betrayal, asking you to participate in catching someone you trusted. But you're doing something important. You're preventing other people from going through what you're experiencing right now." Marcus thought about the 12 confirmed victims, about the 3 who'd chosen death over the consequences of Sarah's manipulation. He thought about Jerome Hayes and the daughter who would grow up without a father. He thought about every person Sarah and David might target in the future if they weren't stopped now, tonight, in front of cameras and witnesses and a world that needed to understand how sophisticated these predators had become. "I understand." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Let's end this." Agent Williams left first, followed by the other members of Catherine's team at staggered intervals that wouldn't attract attention. Catherine remained behind long enough to squeeze Lorraine's shoulder in a gesture that acknowledged shared experience with grief and justice and the complicated space between them. "Mrs. Hayes, we're going to need your testimony when this goes to trial. Everything you saw, everything you heard, all the evidence you collected on your own initiative. It's going to be crucial in building our case. Lorraine's chin lifted slightly. Jerome deserves justice. If testifying helps make that happen, I'll say whatever needs to be said. Catherine turned back to Marcus. One more thing. When you expose Sarah at the ceremony, focus on facts rather than emotion. Don't call her names. Don't let anger take over. Simply state what you know. The calmer and more measured you are, the more credible you'll appear, and the harder it will be for her to spin some alternative narrative that paints you as unstable or vindictive. Then she was gone, and Marcus stood alone with Lorraine in the storage room that had become the fulcrum point of his life's most important decision. Outside, the hotel continued its normal operations. Guests checked in and out. Staff moved through corridors carrying linens and room service trays. The world kept turning despite the small apocalypse unfolding in this converted office space. Thank you. Marcus met Lorraine's eyes, needing her to understand the depth of what her courage had prevented. If you hadn't come to me this morning, if you'd decided it wasn't your place to interfere, or convinced yourself I wouldn't believe you, I'd be walking into my own destruction right now. Lorraine's expression remained solemn. I did it for Jerome, but I'm glad it helped you too. No one deserves what Sarah Mitchell does to people. No one deserves to have their capacity for love turned into a weapon against them. Marcus returned to his suite on the 25th floor, moving through the hotel like a ghost inhabiting his own life. His assistant Rebecca was waiting with a tablet full of last-minute details that required approval. The photographer wanted to know preferred locations for pre-ceremony shots. The florist needed confirmation that the white rose arrangements were acceptable. The DJ had questions about the reception playlist. Marcus approved everything with mechanical efficiency, his mind operating on 2 levels simultaneously. The surface level handled logistics and maintained the appearance of a groom focused on wedding details. The deeper level was busy rewiring every memory of the past 2 years, recontextualizing every moment with Amanda through the lens of what he now knew about Sarah Mitchell. Their first meeting at the Museum of Contemporary Art. She'd been standing in front of that painting for exactly the right amount of time to catch his attention without seeming to wait for him. Her critique had been sophisticated enough to demonstrate knowledge, but contrarian enough to spark conversation. Every element had been calculated to create the illusion of serendipity. Their early dates, the way she'd always suggested modest restaurants, had always insisted on splitting checks, had performed the role of a woman who valued independence and wasn't impressed by wealth. All of it designed to convince him she was different from every other person who tried to get close to his money. The night he told her about Diane, about the marriage that had collapsed under the weight of his early poverty. Amanda had held him while he cried, had whispered reassurances that she loved him for his character rather than his bank account. She'd found his deepest wound and pressed directly against it, giving him exactly what he needed to hear in order to trust her completely. Had she felt anything at all during those moments? Or had it all been performance, lines delivered with practiced sincerity by someone who'd learned to simulate emotions without experiencing them? Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from the device Catherine had given him. The message appeared to come from Amanda. Getting my hair done. Can't stop smiling. This is really happening. The exclamation point felt like mockery now. Every expression of joy, every demonstration of excitement, every tender moment they'd shared was revealed as theater, performed by someone whose real emotions were reserved for David and Sophie in that Lincoln Park townhouse. He typed back, "Can't wait to see you. Only a few more hours." The lie came easier than he'd expected. Perhaps everyone had some capacity for deception when circumstances required it. Perhaps the difference between Marcus and Sarah was simply that he'd never developed his talent for manipulation into a professional skill. Rebecca finally left him alone to get dressed, promising to return in an hour to escort him downstairs for photographs. Marcus stood in front of the floor-length mirror in his suite, adjusting his bow tie with hands that had stopped shaking through sheer force of will. The man looking back at him appeared calm and composed, ready for one of the most important days of his life. No one would guess he was about to turn his wedding into an arrest operation. The boutonniere sat on the dresser, a small arrangement of white roses and greenery that would serve as the signal for Catherine's team to move in. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. Marcus picked it up and examined the flowers, wondering if somewhere in the hotel, Sarah was doing the same thing with her bridal bouquet, checking that every detail was perfect for the performance she'd been rehearsing for 2 years. His thoughts drifted to his mother, to Grace Blackwell, who died believing her son would eventually find happiness. She'd worked herself to exhaustion, giving him opportunities she'd never had, and he'd spent the past 2 years thinking he was honoring her memory by building a family of his own. What would she think of him now, standing in a hotel suite, preparing to publicly expose his own gullibility? But Grace had also taught him about resilience, about getting knocked down and standing back up, about the difference between shame that destroyed and shame that refined. She'd cleaned houses for families who treated her like furniture, and she'd held her head high because she understood her worth existed independent of other people's recognition. Marcus could do the same. He could stand at that altar and tell the truth, and refuse to be diminished by the fact that someone had successfully deceived him. The shame belonged to Sarah Mitchell and David Mitchell, and whatever network of accomplices had helped them destroy 14 men's lives before attempting to destroy his. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus opened it to find Catherine Morrison standing in the hallway, dressed in an elegant navy suit that would pass for wedding attire. Her hair was styled differently, softening her appearance in a way that made her less immediately recognizable as law enforcement. "I wanted to check on you before things get underway." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "This is going to be harder than you think. Standing up there with Sarah, listening to the ceremony, pretending everything is normal while you wait for the moment to drop the hammer. It's psychological warfare, and she's had 2 years of practice learning how to manipulate your responses." Marcus appreciated the warning, even as part of him resented the implication that he might not be strong enough to see this through. "I'll manage." "I'm sure you will. But I need you to understand something." Catherine's voice took on an intensity that demanded attention. "When you remove that boutonniere, when you start telling the truth in front of 600 people and multiple camera crews, Sarah is going to fight back. She's going to cry. She's going to claim you're having some kind of breakdown. She's going to try every manipulation technique in her arsenal to make you the villain and herself the victim." Marcus hadn't considered that possibility. He'd been so focused on the moment of revelation, on exposing Sarah's crimes, that he hadn't thought through how she might respond. Of course, she wouldn't just accept defeat. She'd spent 12 years perfecting her craft. She'd survived 14 successful operations by adapting to changing circumstances and turning potential disasters into opportunities. What should I do when that happens? Stick to facts. Show the photographs. Reference the phone call you overheard. Let the evidence speak for itself. Catherine pulled a small envelope from her jacket pocket and handed it to Marcus. "These are copies of the documents Lorraine found, plus additional material we've gathered during our investigation. Bank records showing the shell companies. Identity documents proving Amanda Sterling doesn't exist outside of the past 3 years. Photographs of Sarah with David and Sophie. When she tries to twist reality, you hold up proof that reality is exactly what you say it is." Marcus took the envelope, its weight somehow both insignificant and crushing. This paper trail represented the documentation of his own destruction, the evidence that someone had systematically dismantled his ability to trust while building a trap that would have swallowed everything he'd worked for. "There's one more thing you should know." Catherine's expression shifted into something that looked like reluctant respect. "We found records suggesting Sarah was researching your mother's employment history. She knew Grace Blackwell worked as domestic help for several wealthy families in Chicago. She knew about your father abandoning the family when you were young. She understood exactly how your childhood experiences shaped your vulnerabilities as an adult." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just identified his weaknesses through conversation and observation. She'd researched his history, had studied his mother's life, had built a psychological profile that let her target him with surgical precision. The level of premeditation was staggering. Why are you telling me this? Because when you're standing at that altar, when you're looking at her face and remembering all the good moments you shared, I need you to remember that none of it was spontaneous. None of it was real. Every laugh, every kiss, every intimate conversation was choreographed by someone who studied you like a scientist studies lab rats. You weren't her partner. You were her research subject. Catherine left him with that thought, and Marcus finished getting dressed in silence. The tuxedo fit perfectly, tailored to his exact measurements by the same designer who'd created his suits for business meetings and charity galas. He'd spent $5,000 on this outfit, had gone through multiple fittings to ensure every detail was flawless. All for a wedding that would never reach the point of exchanging vows. Vosé returned at 1:30 to collect him, chattering cheerfully about how beautiful everything looked downstairs, how excited the guests seemed, how this was going to be a day no one would ever forget. Marcus agreed with appropriate enthusiasm while thinking about how right she was for reasons she couldn't possibly imagine. The grand ballroom had been transformed into something spectacular. 10,000 white roses created a pathway from the entrance to the altar. Candles flickered in tall glass cylinders. The string quartet played soft classical music that floated through air perfumed by flowers and expensive cologne. 600 guests filled the chairs arranged in neat rows, their designer outfits creating a kaleidoscope of wealth and influence. Marcus recognized senators and CEOs, celebrities and philanthropists, the kind of people whose presence at an event signaled its importance. They'd all come to witness his happiness, to celebrate his supposed triumph over loneliness, to toast the beginning of a partnership they believed represented love conquering the corrupting influence of wealth. Instead, they were about to witness something else entirely. Catherine Morrison had positioned herself near the back of the room, her posture relaxed, but her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Marcus spotted 3 other agents distributed throughout the crowd, each one dressed like a guest, but maintaining strategic positions that would allow them to reach the altar quickly when needed. Somewhere in the room, probably in the AV booth that controlled the video displays, more agents were monitoring the wire, transmitting everything Marcus said or heard. Lorraine Hayes stood against the side wall in her hotel uniform, having volunteered to work the event so she could be present for the conclusion of the investigation her brother's death had initiated. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space, and she gave him the smallest nod. Solidarity between victims, between survivors, between people who understood that sometimes courage meant burning down your own life to prevent someone else's destruction. The music shifted to signal the ceremony's beginning. Marcus took his position at the altar beside Reverend Thomas Caldwell, who'd agreed to officiate despite limited notice because Marcus had donated $3 million to his church's community programs over the past 5 years. The Reverend smiled warmly, completely unaware that the ceremony he was about to conduct would never reach completion. The bridesmaids began their processional. 3 women Marcus had met for the first time yesterday, all supposedly friends from Amanda's past, who'd flown in from different cities. How much had Sarah paid them? Or were they also part of the operation, experienced actors who'd performed similar roles in previous cons? Marcus would probably never know, and it didn't matter. They were irrelevant compared to what was coming. Then the music swelled, and the doors opened, and Amanda appeared. She was radiant. There was no other word for it. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk that must have cost $40,000, custom designed to fit her perfectly. Her hair had been arranged in an elegant updo that showcased her face. Her makeup was subtle but flawless. She looked like every fantasy of bridal perfection, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. This was the woman he'd loved. This was the person he'd imagined growing old with, building a family with, sharing his life with through whatever triumphs and disasters the future held. And none of it had been real. The woman walking toward him down that rose-petal path was named Sarah Mitchell, and she was coming to complete the most lucrative con of her career. Amanda reached the altar and took her position across from Marcus. Up close, he could see her eyes were slightly glassy, and he realized she'd probably taken something to help her cry on cue. Every detail had been planned. Every element of her performance had been choreographed to maximize emotional impact. "You look beautiful." The words came out automatically, muscle memory from 2 years of compliments and affection. "You're crying." Amanda reached up to touch his face, and Marcus realized there were indeed tears streaming down his cheeks. His body was grieving what his mind already knew was lost. Happy tears? Something like that. Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice rolled out over the assembled guests with the practiced cadence of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times. Marcus barely heard the words. His attention was split between Amanda's face and the weight of the boutonniere pinned to his lapel. That small arrangement of flowers represented the line between continuing the performance and ending it, between maintaining the lie and embracing the truth. How much longer should he wait? The plan was to let the ceremony progress far enough that Amanda couldn't claim it had never been serious, far enough that the legal implications of attempted marriage fraud would be clear, but not so far that Marcus actually became legally bound to her. Catherine had suggested stopping just before the exchange of vows, at the moment when the Reverend asked if anyone objected to the union. The traditional question came: "If anyone knows of any reason these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." Silence stretched across the ballroom. 600 people waited for the formality to pass so the ceremony could continue. No one ever actually objected at this point. It was a relic from an earlier era, a symbolic gesture that modern weddings preserved more out of tradition than expectation. Marcus's hand moved toward the boutonniere. This was the moment. This was when he'd signal Catherine's team to move in, when he'd begin the process of publicly exposing everything Sarah had done. His fingers touched the delicate flowers, preparing to remove them from his jacket. Then Amanda spoke. "Marcus, darling, are you all right? You seem distant." She was looking at him with those eyes that had convinced him she understood his soul, that had made him believe he'd finally found someone who saw past his wealth to the man underneath. Even now, knowing everything he knew, part of him wanted to believe the concern in her expression was genuine. Part of him wanted to wake up and discover this had all been a terrible mistake, that Amanda really was who she claimed to be, that love could actually survive contact with the cynical reality of his wealth. But Catherine's words echoed in his memory. Sarah had researched his mother. She'd studied his childhood. She'd built a profile of his psychological weaknesses and exploited them with the precision of someone who'd done this 14 times before. Every moment of the parent connection had been calculation. Every expression of love had been performance. Marcus removed the boutonniere and placed it carefully on the altar. "Actually, Reverend Caldwell, I do have something I need to say before we continue." The room seemed to hold its breath. Amanda's smile flickered but held, her training carrying her through the unexpected deviation from script. Marcus could see confusion in the Reverend's expression, concern spreading through the front rows of guests who could sense something was wrong without understanding what. "I've been thinking a lot about truth lately, about honesty and trust, and the foundation that marriage requires." Marcus kept his voice level, following Catherine's advice about staying calm and factual. "And I've realized I can't proceed with this ceremony until I address some questions about my fiancé's identity and intentions." Amanda's expression shifted subtly, the concern morphing into something harder to read. "Marcus, what are you talking about? If you're nervous, we can—" "Your name isn't Amanda Sterling." Marcus pulled the envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "Your name is Sarah Mitchell. You're married to a man named David Mitchell. You have a 5-year-old daughter named Sophie, and for the past 2 years you've been running a sophisticated fraud operation designed to steal my fortune while framing me for money laundering." The gasps from the audience were audible even over the sudden pounding of Marcus's heart. Amanda's face went through a series of rapid transformations: shock, confusion, hurt, anger. The performance was impressive. If Marcus hadn't spent the morning hiding in her trunk, listening to her real voice discuss the exhaustion of maintaining her act, he might have believed her reaction was genuine. "That's insane. Marcus, someone has obviously fed you terrible lies. I don't know anyone named David or Sophie. This morning at 8:23, you received a phone call while driving from this hotel to a townhouse in Lincoln Park." Marcus pulled photographs from the envelope and held them up. The closest guests could see images of Sarah embracing David, of her holding Sophie, of the three of them together in the living room of a home Marcus had never been told existed. "You told David that after today, quote, we'll have full access, and that you were tired of this exhausting performance. You discussed plans to transfer money through shell companies in Delaware and Nevada. You told your daughter that mommy would be home soon, and you could all be together again." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Guests were talking over each other, pulling out phones to capture this unexpected drama. The camera crews that had been hired to document the ceremony were now recording what would become national news within hours. Amanda's bridesmaids looked confused and alarmed. Reverend Caldwell had stepped back from the altar, clearly uncertain about his role in whatever was unfolding. And Amanda herself had stopped pretending. The mask of confused innocence had fallen away, replaced by cold calculation. She was assessing the room, looking for exits, measuring her options against the reality that her operation had just collapsed in the most public way possible. "You don't know what you're doing." Her voice had changed, the warmth drained out of it. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Special Agent Catherine Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Catherine was already moving through the crowd, her badge raised high enough for everyone to see. 3 other agents converged on the altar from different directions, boxing Amanda in before she could attempt to flee. "Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." Amanda tried to run anyway. She kicked off her shoes and bolted for the side exit, her wedding dress hampering her movement, but desperation driving her forward. She made it perhaps 15 feet before 2 agents caught her arms and brought her to the ground. The tackle was controlled and professional, but the symbolism was devastating. A bride in a $40,000 dress being restrained by federal agents while 600 people watched in shock. "You're making a mistake!" Amanda was screaming now, all pretense of sophistication abandoned. "Marcus is lying. He's having some kind of breakdown. Someone stop this!" But no one moved to help her. The evidence was too clear. The photographs Marcus had shown, the recorded phone conversation that Catherine's team had already transmitted to the ballroom speakers, the documentation of shell companies and false identities, all combined to paint a picture that no amount of protestation could obscure. Catherine read Amanda her rights in a voice that carried across the now silent ballroom. The guests watched with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident, unable to look away even as their understanding of reality reorganized itself around this new information. A wedding had become an arrest. A celebration had become an exposure. A private ceremony had become a public cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances. Marcus stood at the altar, still holding the envelope full of evidence, watching federal agents handcuff the woman he'd been about to marry. He felt empty, vindicated but hollow, successful in preventing his own destruction, but devastated by the confirmation that everything he'd built with Amanda had been constructed on lies. "We're also executing arrest warrants for David Mitchell and several accomplices." Catherine secured Amanda's wrists with zip ties when she continued to struggle against the handcuffs. "We've had teams watching your residence since early this morning. Your husband and your daughter are both in protective custody, while we sort out the full scope of your operation." The mention of Sophie seemed to break something in Amanda. The fight went out of her body. She sagged against the agents holding her arms, and when she looked up at Marcus, her expression held none of the calculated manipulation he'd seen before. Just exhaustion and defeat, and something that might have been genuine emotion for the first time in their entire relationship. "She didn't know. Sophie has no idea what David and I do for a living. Please don't punish her for my choices." Marcus wanted to feel satisfaction at her defeat. He wanted to experience triumph at having exposed her before she could destroy him. Instead, he felt tired beyond measure, as if the past 4 hours had aged him a decade. He'd lost something that morning in the parking lot when Lorraine Hayes had grabbed his arm. Not just a relationship or a future with Amanda, but some fundamental belief about his ability to recognize truth when it stood in front of him. "Get her out of here." Catherine gestured to her team, and they began escorting Amanda toward the service exit that would spare the assembled guests from having to watch a bride being led away in handcuffs. Amanda didn't resist, her earlier defiance replaced by resignation. She looked back once, her eyes finding Marcus's across the chaotic ballroom. "I did care about you. Not enough to stop, but more than I've cared about any of the others, if that means anything." Then she was gone, and Marcus stood alone at the altar, surrounded by hundreds of people who'd come to celebrate his happiness and instead witnessed his humiliation. The roses still perfumed the air. The candles still flickered in their glass cylinders. The string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments sitting silent as the musicians tried to process what they'd just seen. Reverend Caldwell approached cautiously. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. If there's anything I can do..." "Thank you, Reverend, but I think the ceremony is over." The understatement of the century. Marcus descended from the altar and began walking toward the exit, needing to be anywhere except this ballroom full of witnesses to his devastation. Guests parted to let him through, their faces showing various combinations of sympathy and morbid curiosity. Some looked horrified, others looked scandalized. A few looked almost excited, already composing the texts and social media posts they'd send out describing the most dramatic wedding disaster in recent memory. Lorraine intercepted him near the door. "You did it. You stopped her." "I did." Marcus heard the words come out flat and emotionless. "Jerome can rest easier, knowing Sarah Mitchell won't destroy anyone else." "What will you do now?" The question hung in the air between them. What did someone do after their wedding became an arrest operation? After their life partner was revealed as a predator? After public humiliation on a scale that would make headlines for weeks? Marcus had built a $2.4 billion empire by always knowing the next move. But standing here in the aftermath of Sarah's exposure, he had no idea what came next. "I'm going to talk to Catherine Morrison about what happens during the investigation and trial. I'm going to cooperate fully with whatever the FBI needs from me. And then, I'm going to figure out how to rebuild trust in my own judgment after spending 2 years being completely wrong about someone I thought I knew." Lorraine squeezed his hand once, the gesture conveying more understanding than words could manage. She'd survived her own version of this devastation when Jerome died. She'd found a way to transform grief and rage into something productive. Maybe Marcus could do the same. He found Catherine in a service corridor being used as a temporary command center. Agents were already boxing up equipment and preparing to transport Amanda to federal custody. The efficiency was impressive. Within minutes, all evidence of law enforcement presence would be erased from the Pinnacle Grand Hotel, leaving behind only shocked guests and a ballroom full of unused wedding decorations. How long has the FBI been investigating Sarah Mitchell? Marcus needed to understand the scope of what he'd barely escaped. Catherine looked up from the tablet she'd been typing notes on. 8 months, officially. But we've been aware of her operation for closer to 3 years. The challenge has been building a case that would stick. She's careful about covering her tracks, and her victims usually refuse to testify because they're either too ashamed or too compromised by the money laundering schemes. You're the first person who is willing to go public before she'd actually stolen anything. Lorraine Hayes deserves credit for that. If she hadn't come to me this morning, I'd be married to Sarah right now and completely unaware of what was coming. Mrs. Hayes will be recognized appropriately when this goes to trial. Her initiative in collecting evidence on her own time, her courage in approaching you despite knowing she could lose her job, all of it will be documented. Catherine's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, Mr. Blackwell, You handled yourself well in there. I know it wasn't easy standing at that altar and exposing her in front of everyone you know." Easy didn't begin to describe it. Marcus had spent the final minutes of the ceremony fighting against every instinct that screamed to preserve his privacy, to handle this quietly, to avoid the public spectacle that would define him in headlines for weeks.
But Catherine had been right that Sarah needed to be exposed publicly. Her face needed to be associated with her crimes. Her methods needed to be documented and publicized, so that future potential victims might recognize the warning signs. What happens to Sophie? The question surprised Marcus even as he asked it. After everything Sarah had done, after all the calculated manipulation and deliberate cruelty, he still found himself concerned about the 5-year-old girl who'd had no choice about being born into a family of con artists. Catherine's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "David Mitchell's mother has been contacted. She's flying in from Seattle to take temporary custody while we sort out the legal situation. Sophie will be placed in family care if possible. If not, the state will make other arrangements. But she won't suffer for her parents' choices." The relief Marcus felt was disproportionate to his connection with a child he'd never met. But the image of Sophie running into Sarah's arms in that Lincoln Park townhouse had stayed with him. That little girl's love for her mother had been genuine, uncomplicated by the fraud and manipulation that defined Sarah's other relationships. She deserved a chance at normalcy, at growing up without the shadow of her parents' crimes defining her future. "I'd like to establish a trust fund for her education, something that can't be touched until she's 18, that ensures she'll have opportunities regardless of what happens to Sarah and David." Catherine studied him for a long moment. "That's generous, given the circumstances." "It's not generosity. It's recognition that Sophie is a victim too. Sarah used her own daughter as part of the performance, had me believe a child didn't exist, so I'd think I was building a family from scratch rather than breaking one apart. That's unconscionable. And Sophie shouldn't suffer lifelong consequences because her parents are criminals." Catherine made a note on her tablet. "I'll make sure your attorney gets the appropriate contact information for setting up that trust. Now, we need to discuss your testimony. This case is going to trial, probably within 6 months. You'll need to be prepared to recount everything that happened, to be cross-examined by defense attorneys who will try to make you look gullible or vindictive or somehow complicit in Sarah's schemes." The prospect of reliving this disaster in a courtroom, of having Sarah's defense team pick apart his judgment and question his intelligence, filled Marcus with dread. But the alternative was letting her walk away with a reduced sentence or no conviction at all. Too many of her previous victims had refused to testify, and that silence had allowed her to continue operating for more than a decade. "I'll testify. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." They spent the next hour going over details that would be important for the prosecution. The timeline of his relationship with Sarah, the specific moments when he'd noticed inconsistencies but dismissed them, the financial arrangements they'd discussed, everything that could help build a case demonstrating premeditation and calculated fraud, rather than a relationship that had simply gone wrong. When Catherine finally released him, the sun was setting over Chicago and the Pinnacle Grand was quiet. Most of the wedding guests had left, either returning to their hotel rooms or finding other evening activities now that the ceremony had been dramatically canceled. The ballroom staff was already breaking down the decorations, removing 10,000 roses and hundreds of candles with practiced efficiency. Marcus returned to his suite and found it exactly as he'd left it, his luggage still packed for a honeymoon that would never happen. He'd planned to take Sarah to a private resort in northern Michigan, a week of isolation and intimacy where they could begin their marriage away from the demands of his business and her supposed architectural projects. Instead, she was sitting in a federal holding cell while agents cataloged evidence of her crimes. His phone buzzed with messages. Rebecca wanted to know if he needed anything. His attorney demanded immediate consultation about legal implications. Business associates were sending carefully worded texts that managed to express sympathy while fishing for details they could gossip about later. The wedding photographer was asking whether he still wanted the pre-ceremony shots, given that the actual ceremony had ended in an arrest. Marcus ignored all of them. He stood at the window, looking out over the city his mother had worked herself to death trying to give him access to. The city where he'd built a fortune that had made him a target for predators like Sarah Mitchell. Somewhere out there, 13 other men were living with the consequences of falling for her performance. Some had rebuilt their lives. Others had been destroyed completely. And 3 of them were dead, unable to bear the shame of being used so thoroughly. He thought about Jerome Hayes, dead at 34 with a wife who'd abandoned him and a daughter he'd never get to see grow up. Lorraine had spent 5 years studying financial fraud because she couldn't save her brother, but she could prevent his death from being meaningless. She transformed her grief into expertise and her expertise into intervention. And that intervention had saved Marcus from becoming victim number 15. Tomorrow, the story would be everywhere. Billionaire's wedding ends in arrest. Con artist exposed by courageous hotel worker. Another cautionary tale about the corruption of wealth and the sophistication of modern fraud. Marcus's name would be attached to this disaster forever. A permanent reminder that even successful people could be manipulated by someone skilled enough in reading human vulnerability. But tonight, alone in a hotel suite overlooking a city full of people who'd never know his name, Marcus allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not the money that Sarah had tried to steal, that was replaceable. Not the reputation that would be damaged by this public disaster, that could be rebuilt with time and careful management. What he'd lost was the belief that he could recognize truth when it looked him in the eye and told him it loved him. What he'd lost was the hope that his money wouldn't always be the most interesting thing about him to the people he let get close. What he'd lost was the comfortable certainty that his mother's lessons about integrity and character were sufficient protection against the world's more sophisticated predators. Sarah Mitchell had taught him that some people were better at lying than others were at detecting lies. That vulnerability wasn't weakness, but it could become a weapon in the wrong hands. That love itself could be forged and polished and presented as genuine by someone who'd studied the craft long enough to perfect every detail of the performance. And the worst part was knowing that somewhere deep in the past 2 years, there might have been moments when Sarah's feelings had been partially genuine, when she'd looked at him and seen something beyond a mark, beyond a target, beyond a job that needed completing. The comment she'd made while being arrested, "I did care about you, more than I've cared about any of the others," might have been one final manipulation, or it might have been a rare moment of honesty from someone who'd spent so long lying that truth had become foreign. Marcus would probably never know which interpretation was correct, and maybe that uncertainty was the cruelest part of all. The media descended on Marcus like locusts within 12 hours of the arrest. By Sunday morning, his face was on every news channel, every website, every social media platform that trafficked in stories about wealth and deception. The headlines varied in their specificity, but shared a common theme. Billionaire saved from marriage fraud by brave hotel worker. The narrative had already solidified before Marcus had time to shape it himself. His publicist, Vanessa, called at 6 a.m, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from managing crisis communications for high-profile clients. "We need to get ahead of this. I'm scheduling interviews with sympathetic journalists who will let you control the narrative. The longer we wait, the more the story gets told without your input." Marcus declined. He had no interest in becoming the face of victimhood, in parading his humiliation across television screens so that strangers could analyze where he'd gone wrong and what red flags he should have noticed. The FBI had enough footage from the wedding cameras to document what had happened. Catherine Morrison was already coordinating with the prosecutor's office to ensure the case against Sarah Mitchell would proceed regardless of media coverage. What Marcus needed was distance from the spectacle his life had become. He needed space to process betrayal that felt like it had carved out vital organs and left him hollow. So he did what any person with unlimited resources would do when seeking privacy. He disappeared. The estate in Door County, Wisconsin, sat on 40 acres of forested land overlooking Lake Michigan. Marcus had purchased it 3 years ago as a retreat from Chicago's demands, A place where he could think without the constant pressure of meetings and obligations. He brought Amanda here once, last autumn, and they'd walked along the shore while she'd talked about her fictional childhood and her imaginary parents and the architecture she supposedly dreamed of designing. Everything she'd said had been lies, but the memory of her voice blending with the sound of waves remained stubbornly pleasant despite his knowledge of its falseness. That was the insidious thing about skilled manipulation. The moments themselves had felt real, even if the person creating them had been performing a role. Marcus's emotional responses to those experiences couldn't be retroactively erased just because their foundation had been fraudulent. He spent the first week alone, refusing calls from everyone except Catherine Morrison and his attorney. The isolation suited him. The estate staff had been given paid leave. The security system was sophisticated enough that Marcus didn't need guards watching the perimeter. Just him and 40 acres and the endless sound of water against shore. The nightmares started on the third day. He'd dream he was back at the altar, going through with the ceremony despite knowing everything about Sarah's deception. In the dreams, he'd say his vows and sign the marriage certificate and watch as federal agents arrested him instead of her. The dreams always ended with him in a courtroom, trying to explain to a judge why he'd ignored so many warnings, why he'd been stupid enough to trust a professional liar, why he deserved anything except complete financial ruin and public humiliation. He'd wake up sweating, his heart racing, the certainty of dream logic taking several minutes to fade into the more complicated reality where he was the victim rather than the criminal. But even waking reality offered limited comfort. Yes, he'd avoided Sarah's trap. Yes, Catherine's team had arrested her before she could steal his fortune. But the victory felt Pyrrhic when the cost was his ability to trust his own judgment about the people closest to him. Catherine called on the 8th day with updates about the investigation. We've identified 17 victims total, not 14. 3 more came forward after seeing the news coverage. The earliest case we can definitively connect to Sarah and David Mitchell dates back to 2012. Before that, the trail gets murky. They might have been operating under different names, or this might have been when they started working together. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. How much did they steal in total? $58 million across all 17 cases. Some victims they only got a few $100,000 from before circumstances forced them to abort. Others they bled dry over years. You were going to be their biggest score. The joint accounts Amanda pushed you to establish would have given them access to assets worth over $800 million once properly leveraged. The number was staggering. Not because Marcus couldn't afford to lose $800 million, though the hit would have been devastating, but because it represented the scale of Sarah's ambition, the careful planning that had gone into positioning herself as his wife so she could systematically dismantle everything he'd built over decades of work. What about the 3 men who died? Marcus needed to understand the full scope of what Lorraine Hayes had prevented. Can Sarah and David be charged in connection with those deaths? Catherine's pause suggested she'd anticipated this question and wasn't satisfied with her answer. Legally, no. We can't prove they intended for those men to commit suicide. We can't even prove they knew the men would commit suicide, though I personally believe they understood the psychological pressure they were creating. But causation in cases like this is almost impossible to establish beyond reasonable doubt. What we can prove is fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. That's enough to put them away for decades. Marcus thought about Jerome Hayes dying in a garage while his sister worked her shift at the Pinnacle Grand, unaware that the last time she'd see her brother alive had already passed. Thought about the other 2 men whose names Catherine had mentioned in earlier briefings, both dead before Sarah and David had even targeted Marcus. Those deaths couldn't be avenged through legal prosecution, but maybe they could be honored through prevention. I want to establish a foundation focused on financial fraud education and victim support, something that helps people recognize romance scams before they become invested, something that provides resources for victims who are dealing with the aftermath.
Marcus heard himself making the commitment before he'd consciously decided to do it, his mind working through implications while his mouth shaped words. We'll call it the Jerome Hayes Foundation. Lorraine should run it if she's willing. That's generous. Also strategic. Catherine's tone suggested approval. The defense is going to paint you as a vindictive billionaire who couldn't handle rejection. Setting up a foundation that helps other victims undercuts that narrative, shows you're thinking beyond your own situation. Marcus hadn't been thinking strategically at all. He'd been thinking about the hollowness inside his chest that wouldn't fade no matter how long he stared at Lake Michigan or how many miles he walked along the estate's trails. Grief demanded transformation. Pain needed purpose. He couldn't undo Sarah's crimes, couldn't resurrect the men who'd died because of her manipulations, couldn't even fully repair his own psychological damage. But he could, maybe, prevent future victims from experiencing the same devastation. The idea took root and began growing into something concrete. Marcus spent the next 3 days researching existing fraud prevention organizations, identifying gaps in their coverage, analyzing the specific patterns that had made Sarah's operation successful. She'd exploited the intersection of wealth and loneliness, targeting men who had resources but lacked emotional connection. Traditional fraud prevention focused on protecting assets. What Marcus wanted to create was something that acknowledged the emotional vulnerability that made asset protection irrelevant. Lorraine agreed to consider running the foundation when Marcus called to propose the idea. Her voice over the phone sounded steadier than it had in the hotel storage room, as if watching Sarah's arrest had provided some closure to years of grief. Jerome would have wanted something positive to come from his death. He was always looking for ways to help people, even when he was drowning in his own problems. This feels right. They spent an hour discussing structure and scope. Lorraine had ideas about outreach to support groups, about partnerships with law enforcement agencies that handled financial crimes, about educational programs that could be implemented in business schools and wealth management firms. Her knowledge was encyclopedic. 5 years of obsessive research translated into practical applications that could actually prevent harm. Marcus found himself energized for the first time since the arrest. The foundation gave him something to focus on beyond his own humiliation, beyond the endless mental replays of moments with Sarah that he now understood had been performance rather than intimacy. He could build something meaningful from the wreckage of his failed wedding, could honor both Jerome Hayes' memory and his own narrow escape by creating resources that might save someone else from similar destruction. But first, he had to face Sarah herself one more time. Catherine had called 3 days after their conversation about the foundation to deliver news that sent ice water through Marcus's veins. Sarah wants to see you. She's claiming she has information about your mother that you need to know. Information that will, quote, change how you understand your entire life. The manipulation was transparent. Sarah was dangling some supposed revelation about Grace Blackwell as bait, hoping Marcus would visit her in custody and potentially say something that could be used in her defense. Catherine had been clear that visiting wasn't required, that anything Sarah claimed to know was probably fabricated. But Marcus found himself unable to dismiss the possibility entirely. His mother had died when he was 31, cancer eating through her body faster than the inadequate insurance could cover. She'd worked until 2 weeks before the end, cleaning houses and cooking meals and pressing shirts for families who barely acknowledged her existence. Grace had never complained about the indignity of serving people less intelligent and less capable than herself. She'd accepted her circumstances as temporary obstacles rather than permanent conditions. But there had been gaps in her stories about Marcus's father, inconsistencies she'd waved away with vague references to a man who'd left before Marcus was old enough to remember him. What if Sarah actually did know something? What if her research into his background had uncovered information Marcus himself didn't possess? He made the decision on a Tuesday morning, calling Catherine to arrange a supervised meeting at the Federal Detention Center where Sarah was being held pending trial. The visit would be recorded. Anything said could be used in legal proceedings. Marcus understood the risks and accepted them because the alternative was spending the rest of his life wondering what Sarah might have revealed.
The Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago was everything Marcus had never expected to visit. Concrete walls and metal detectors, and guards who look at him with a particular brand of suspicion reserved for civilians entering a space designed for criminals. Catherine met him at the security checkpoint, her expression neutral, but her eyes communicating warning. Remember that everything she says could be calculated to manipulate you. Even if she shares true information, the way she presents it will be designed to serve her purposes. Don't let her control the emotional tenor of this conversation. Marcus nodded his understanding, but his stomach was tight with anxiety that had nothing to do with legal strategy. He was about to sit across from the woman he'd almost married, the woman who'd studied him like a research subject, the woman who'd planned his financial destruction while sharing his bed and his hopes for the future. No amount of federal supervision could make that interaction comfortable. They led him to a small room painted institutional beige, furnished with a metal table and 4 chairs bolted to the floor. Sarah sat on the far side wearing an orange jumpsuit that drained color from her complexion. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry. Nothing left of the sophisticated polish that had been her armor during their relationship. She looked up when Marcus entered, and something flickered across her face that might have been genuine emotion. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." Marcus sat down across from her, Catherine taking position against the wall where she could observe but not interfere unless necessary. "You said you had information about my mother. If that was a lie designed to get me here, we can end this now." "It's not a lie." Sarah's voice had lost the warmth he remembered, replaced by flatness that suggested exhaustion or resignation. "I did research on Grace Blackwell as part of building your profile. Standard practice. Understanding family dynamics helps identify emotional vulnerabilities. But I found something I wasn't expecting, and I've been debating whether to tell you since the arrest." Marcus waited, refusing to give her the satisfaction of begging for information she was clearly prepared to share regardless of his reaction. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table between them. "Your mother worked for the Montgomery family from 1985 to 1998. Thomas and Patricia Montgomery owned a real estate development company worth about $40 million at the time. Grace cleaned their house, cooked their meals, raised their children, while Patricia focused on social obligations." Marcus had known about the Montgomery family. His mother had mentioned them occasionally, usually in the context of stories about the ridiculous demands wealthy people made of their domestic staff. He'd never thought to investigate them, never considered that they might be relevant to anything beyond employment history. "Thomas Montgomery was your father." The words landed like a physical blow. Marcus felt his breath catch, his vision narrowing to the woman across from him who'd just rewritten his entire understanding of his origins. "That's impossible. My mother told me my father left when I was 3. She never mentioned the Montgomerys being anything except employers." "Grace was protecting you. Thomas Montgomery was married with 3 legitimate children when he started an affair with your mother. When Grace got pregnant, Thomas paid her $50,000 to keep quiet and leave his employment. The money funded your early childhood. It's why Grace could afford to send you to better schools than most domestic workers' children attended. It's why you had opportunities that should have been beyond her salary range." Marcus struggled to process this information, his mind cataloging memories of his childhood through this new lens. The apartment his mother had rented in a nicer neighborhood than they should have been able to afford, the private tutors she'd hired when he struggled with math, the college application fees she'd paid without apparent strain despite working multiple jobs. He'd always assumed she was just exceptionally good at budgeting, that her sacrifices had been even more extreme than he'd understood. But if she'd had $50,000 from Thomas Montgomery, if she'd been rationing that money across his entire childhood to maximize his advantages, then her financial decisions made different sense. Not sacrifice. Strategy. "How do I know you're not making this up? How do I know this isn't another manipulation designed to serve whatever legal strategy your attorney has developed?"
Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. This is a letter Grace wrote to Thomas Montgomery in 1990. I found it in archived correspondence when I was researching your background. She was asking him to increase the initial payment to cover college tuition.
He refused, said the $50,000 was final, that if she tried to contact him again, he'd claim she was attempting blackmail. Marcus unfolded the paper with hands that trembled despite his effort to maintain composure. The handwriting was his mother's, familiar from years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter. The content was heartbreaking in its dignity. Dear Thomas, I am writing to ask for your help ensuring our son receives proper education. Marcus is exceptionally bright and with adequate support could attend university. The money you provided has been carefully managed, but will not cover costs beyond high school. I'm not asking for ongoing support or recognition. I'm asking you to give your son the same opportunities you provide your other children. Please consider this request. Grace. The formality of the language couldn't hide the desperation underneath. Grace had been begging for help while maintaining the pretense of professional distance, acknowledging their son while accepting that Marcus would never be publicly recognized as Thomas Montgomery's child. The rejection must have devastated her, must have reinforced every lesson she'd learned about class and race and the impossibility of transcending certain boundaries. Marcus looked up at Sarah, understanding now why she'd wanted him to come here, why she'd chosen this particular revelation. You knew about this the entire time we were together? You knew my father was alive and living in Highland Park with his legitimate family. You could have told me at any point. I could have. But it served my purposes better to let you maintain the narrative you'd built around being abandoned by a father who didn't care. Men who feel rejected by their fathers are more vulnerable to romantic manipulation. They're looking for unconditional acceptance, for someone who chooses them despite their perceived deficiencies. I studied your psychology, Marcus. I understood exactly which buttons to push. The clinical analysis of his vulnerabilities should have enraged him. Instead, Marcus found himself feeling almost grateful for her honesty. This was Sarah without the performance, without the careful construction of appealing personality traits. This was the researcher who'd treated him like a subject rather than a person, who'd mapped his emotional landscape with the goal of exploiting every weakness. Why tell me this now? What do you gain from revealing information you could have kept secret? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting into something that looked almost like weariness. Because you're going to testify against me at trial. Because your testimony is going to determine whether I spend 15 years in prison or 30. And I want you to understand that the person sitting across from you in that courtroom is more complicated than the villain you've turned me into. There it was. The manipulation Catherine had warned about. Sarah wasn't sharing this information out of guilt or remorse or belated honesty. She was trying to humanize herself, to create complexity in Marcus's mind that might translate into sympathy when he testified about her crimes. You want me to feel sorry for you. You want me to present yourself as someone who was driven to fraud by circumstance rather than choice. You think telling me about my father somehow balances the scale, makes your crimes less severe because you're also capable of sharing painful truths. I want you to understand that I made choices based on my own history, just like you made choices based on yours. My mother killed herself when I was 11. My father was violent and absent. I aged out of foster care with no resources and no support system. When I met David, he taught me that wealthy people had resources they didn't need or deserve, and that taking from them wasn't really theft. It was redistribution. Marcus felt no sympathy. Sarah's childhood had been terrible, but plenty of people survived terrible childhoods without becoming predators who destroyed lives for profit. Jerome Hayes had been orphaned, had lost his father to violence and his mother to despair, and he'd chosen accounting as a career because he wanted to help people manage their finances responsibly. Trauma didn't excuse behavior. It explained it, but explanation wasn't justification. You're going to prison for a long time, Sarah. My testimony will be truthful and thorough. Nothing you've told me today changes the fact that you spent 2 years systematically planning my destruction while pretending to love me. That's not complicated. That's predatory. He stood to leave, the letter from his mother still clutched in his hand.
Sarah watched him with eyes that held none of the warmth he remembered from their relationship. Just calculation behind exhaustion, a strategic mind still working through variables even in the face of inevitable defeat. For what it's worth, I wasn't entirely lying when I said I cared about you more than the others. You reminded me of what I might have become if circumstances had been different. Ambitious. Self-made. Someone who climbed out of poverty through legitimate means rather than fraud. I almost envied you that choice. Marcus didn't respond. There was nothing to say to someone who viewed empathy as a tool rather than an emotion, who parsed her own feelings for strategic advantage rather than experiencing them as genuine human connection. He walked out of the detention center with Catherine beside him, emerging into Chicago afternoon sunlight that felt harsh after the fluorescent prison lighting. That was harder than I expected. Marcus handed the letter to Catherine, who scanned it quickly before folding it back into evidence storage. She's good at what she does. Even knowing she's manipulating me, part of me wants to believe she's capable of authentic emotion. That's what makes her dangerous. Sarah Mitchell understands that people want to believe in redemption and complexity. She uses that desire against them, presenting herself as more than a simple criminal because simple criminals are easy to dismiss. Complicated humans with tragic backstories are much harder to condemn. They walked to Catherine's car, the downtown streets busy with afternoon traffic and pedestrians who had no idea they were passing a billionaire who'd just learned his entire origin story had been built on his mother's carefully maintained lie. Marcus felt unmoored, his sense of personal history shifting beneath him like sand under waves. His phone buzzed with a message from his attorney. Thomas Montgomery was threatening to sue if Marcus attempted any contact with the Montgomery family. The letter from Grace apparently constituted evidence of an affair Thomas had spent 36 years denying. His legitimate children had no idea Marcus existed, and Thomas intended to keep it that way. The legal language was polite, but the message was clear. Stay away, or face costly litigation designed to drain resources and create scandal. Marcus sent back a single word: acknowledged. He had no interest in forcing his way into Thomas Montgomery's life or claiming some relationship with half-siblings who'd grown up with advantages he'd been denied. Grace had accepted the $50,000 and built a life for her son without Montgomery's support. She'd raised Marcus to understand that dignity came from self-determination rather than family connection. Chasing acknowledgement from a man who'd rejected him before birth would dishonor everything his mother had stood for. But the knowledge itself changed things. Marcus had spent his entire life believing he'd been abandoned by someone too weak or too selfish to stay. The reality was messier. Thomas Montgomery had been a wealthy man having an affair with domestic staff. Grace had been young and vulnerable and pregnant in a situation with no good options. The $50,000 had been hush money, but it had also been the foundation of everything Marcus had become. He wondered if his mother had watched from wherever the dead watched as her son built a fortune worth billions using advantages purchased with Montgomery's guilt money. Whether she'd felt vindicated that the child Thomas refused to claim had surpassed his legitimate heirs in wealth and influence. Whether she died believing the secret was safe, that Marcus would never learn his father had been alive all along. The questions spiraled through his mind during the drive back to Door County, Catherine offering updates about the prosecution timeline that Marcus barely registered. His thoughts were stuck in the past, rewinding through memories of his mother with new understanding. Every time she'd told him poverty was circumstantial, every lesson about self-worth and determination, every moment she'd pushed him to excel despite the obstacles of race and class. All of it had been built on knowledge she'd kept from him until her death. Was that betrayal? Or protection? Marcus couldn't decide. Grace had lied to him about his origins, but she'd also given him the freedom to build an identity that wasn't shadowed by rejection from a wealthy father. He'd succeeded on his own terms, motivated by the belief that he was proving something to a man who'd abandoned him. If he'd known Thomas Montgomery was alive and prosperous and simply uninterested, Would that knowledge have driven him harder or broken him earlier? The estate felt different when he returned that evening. The isolation that had been comforting now felt oppressive. 40 acres of land where he could avoid human contact, but couldn't escape his own thoughts. Marcus found himself walking the shoreline trail in darkness, the sound of waves providing rhythm to reflections that refused to organize into coherent conclusions. Sarah had violated his trust in the most calculated way possible. But Grace had also lied to him, had constructed a narrative about his father that served her purposes while obscuring complicated truths. Both women had made choices about what information to share and what to conceal. The difference was motive. Grace had hidden the truth to protect her son from painful rejection. Sarah had hidden the truth to facilitate theft and destruction. Intent mattered. But the experience of deception felt similar, regardless of underlying motive. Marcus had spent 2 years building a future with someone who didn't exist, someone who'd performed a role designed to extract maximum value while providing minimum genuine connection. He'd spent 31 years believing a story about his father that his mother had carefully crafted to shield him from the reality that his existence had been an inconvenience to a wealthy man who'd refused to claim him. Both deceptions had shaped his psychology in profound ways. Both had influenced the choices he made and the person he'd become. And now, both had been exposed within days of each other, leaving Marcus to rebuild his self-understanding without the foundation he'd assumed was solid. Lorraine called that night with news about the foundation. She'd been researching similar organizations and had connections with several financial crimes investigators who'd expressed interest in serving as advisors. The momentum was building faster than expected. Energy driven by the publicity around Sarah's arrest and the public's fascination with a story that combined wealth and romance and spectacular betrayal. "I've been thinking about Jerome a lot," Lorraine's voice carried through the phone with quiet intensity. "About how alone he must have felt when the FBI was investigating him, when Jennifer left and took their daughter, when everyone assumed he was guilty because the evidence had been manufactured to make him look complicit. If the foundation had existed back then, if he'd had resources and support and people who understood what romance fraud actually looked like, maybe he'd still be alive." Marcus understood the impulse to believe that intervention could have prevented tragedy. He'd been entertaining similar thoughts about his own near miss with Sarah's operation. If Lorraine hadn't approached him in that parking lot, if she hadn't spent 5 years educating herself about fraud patterns, if she hadn't recognized the signs of an operation similar to what had destroyed her brother, Marcus would have married Sarah and signed documents giving her access to assets worth hundreds of millions. The narrow margin between disaster and salvation haunted him. So many small choices had aligned to create the moment when Lorraine grabbed his arm and told him to hide in Amanda's trunk. If any single element had been different, if she'd hesitated or he'd dismissed her, or Sarah had locked her trunk that particular morning, the outcome would have been catastrophic. "We can't save people who are already gone." Marcus spoke the truth they both needed to acknowledge. "But we can honor them by preventing future deaths. The foundation will be Jerome's legacy. Every person we help will be evidence that his death mattered, that something good came from the destruction." They talked for another hour about implementation strategies and funding models. Marcus committed $50 million as initial capital, enough to establish credibility and fund operations for several years while they built out additional revenue streams. Lorraine would draw a salary that reflected her expertise and her role as executive director. They'd hire victim advocates and financial analysts and legal experts who could provide comprehensive support to people dealing with romance fraud. The work gave Marcus purpose beyond processing his own grief and anger. He could transform his humiliation into resources for others, could use his wealth to create something his mother would have been proud of. Grace Blackwell had spent her life serving wealthy families who barely acknowledged her humanity. The Jerome Hayes Foundation would serve people who'd been exploited by those who saw them as resources rather than individuals. Poetic justice. Or maybe just justice, unmodified by adjectives. Marcus had the resources to create meaningful change, and using those resources to prevent suffering seemed like the only response to his own narrow escape
that honored both his mother's sacrifices and Jerome Hayes's unnecessary death. The trial was scheduled for early September, 4 months after the arrest. Catherine kept Marcus updated on developments as the prosecution built their case. Sarah's attorney was arguing that the relationship had been genuine and that any financial impropriety was the result of Marcus's controlling behavior rather than fraud. The defense strategy was transparently absurd given the evidence, but it was designed to create reasonable doubt in at least one juror's mind. David Mitchell had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Sarah in exchange for reduced sentencing. His cooperation had filled in gaps about their operation's scope and methodology. They'd been running some version of this con for 15 years, not 12. The earlier cases had been smaller and less sophisticated, but the fundamental approach remained consistent. Identify lonely, wealthy men, research their vulnerabilities, construct an identity that would appeal to their specific psychology, execute a long-term operation that ended with either massive theft or framing the victim for money laundering. The 3 men who'd died had all been framed. Their suicides had resulted from the combination of financial ruin, criminal investigation, and social isolation that Sarah and David had deliberately engineered. David claimed Sarah had been disturbed by the first death, had wanted to stop targeting vulnerable men entirely, but the money was too good, and David had convinced her that the victim's choices weren't their responsibility. Marcus read the psychological evaluations and witness statements with growing horror at how close he'd come to joining those statistics. If Lorraine hadn't intervened, if Sarah's operation had proceeded as planned, Marcus would have been facing federal investigation for money laundering while watching his foundation's reputation collapse and his business relationships deteriorate. The pressure would have been immense. The shame would have been crushing. Would he have survived it? Marcus wanted to believe his resources would have protected him, that his wealth could have bought legal defense strong enough to prove his innocence. But Jerome Hayes had tried to prove his innocence, had exhausted his savings on legal fees, and had ultimately died believing no one would ever accept his version of events. 3 other men had reached similar conclusions about their situations. What made Marcus think he would have been different except for luck and Lorraine's intervention? The question haunted him through the summer months. He returned to Chicago in August to prepare for testimony, working with prosecutors to ensure his account would be clear and compelling. They practiced cross-examination, anticipated defense strategies, prepared him for the reality that Sarah's attorney would try to paint him as a vindictive billionaire who'd fabricated fraud allegations to punish a woman for breaking up with him. The evidence is overwhelming. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who'd spent 20 years handling financial crimes. But juries are unpredictable, and Sarah Mitchell is going to present well. She'll cry on the stand. She'll talk about her difficult childhood. She'll claim she genuinely loved you and that the relationship fell apart because you were paranoid about gold diggers. Your job is to remain calm and factual, regardless of what she or her attorney say about you. Marcus understood the assignment. He'd been performing calm competence his entire professional life, navigating boardrooms full of people who wanted to see him fail. A courtroom was just another arena where perception mattered as much as reality. He could play the role of credible victim without letting emotion undermine his testimony. But private preparation was different from public performance. When the trial finally began in early September, when Marcus walked into the federal courthouse and saw Sarah sitting at the defense table in a conservative suit that made her look vulnerable and young, he felt his carefully constructed composure waver. This was the woman he'd planned to marry, the woman who'd shared his bed and his hopes and his fears, the woman who'd studied him like a lab specimen while planning his destruction. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 17 victims testified about their experiences with Sarah and David Mitchell. The pattern was consistent enough to be damning. Each man described meeting an attractive woman who seemed uninterested in wealth, who valued conversation and connection over material displays. Each man described a careful courtship that lasted between 1 and 3 years. Each man described financial arrangements that seemed reasonable at the time, but were revealed as sophisticated fraud operations designed to steal assets while creating paper trails that implicated the victim. Marcus testified on day 14, taking the stand with the kind of calm he'd weaponized during hostile takeover negotiations. Jennifer Walsh walked him through the timeline of his relationship with Sarah, the inconsistencies he'd noticed but dismissed, the morning Lorraine Hayes had warned him about the operation.
Marcus kept his voice level and his responses factual, resisting the urge to editorialize or express emotion that could be characterized as vindictive. Sarah's attorney cross-examined for 4 hours, trying to establish that Marcus had been controlling and paranoid, that he'd violated Sarah's privacy by hiding in her trunk, that his wealth made him incapable of understanding normal relationship dynamics. Marcus answered each question with the same measured calm, acknowledging where appropriate and correcting mischaracterizations without becoming defensive. The attorney's final question was designed to rattle him. "Mr. Blackwell, isn't it true that you proposed this elaborate fraud narrative because you couldn't accept that Sarah Mitchell simply didn't want to marry you?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who sat at the defense table with tears streaming down her face, her performance of heartbroken innocence executed with the same skill she'd brought to their entire relationship. Then he looked back at the attorney and delivered the line he'd been preparing for weeks. "I proposed this fraud narrative because it's not a narrative. It's documented reality supported by bank records, identity documents, and testimony from 14 other men she defrauded using identical methods. My inability to accept anything is irrelevant compared to the evidence proving she's a career criminal." The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Sarah showed no emotion when the verdict was read, her mask finally dropping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. She was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. David received 20 years. Their assets were seized and distributed among victims according to a formula that attempted to compensate proportionally for losses. Marcus felt no triumph when the sentence was announced, just exhaustion and a strange sense of anticlimax. He'd spent months building toward this moment, toward public vindication and legal accountability. Now that it had arrived, the victory felt hollow. Sarah Mitchell was going to prison, but that didn't undo the damage she'd caused. It didn't resurrect Jerome Hayes or the other men who'd died. It didn't restore trust that had been systematically violated across 17 separate frauds. Lorraine found him outside the courthouse after sentencing, her expression reflecting similar ambivalence about the outcome. "Justice feels different than I expected. Less satisfying. More empty." Justice is just consequences aligned with actions. It doesn't heal. It doesn't restore. It just establishes that society recognizes harm was done and punishment is warranted. They walked together through downtown Chicago, two people bound by shared experience with Sarah Mitchell's particular brand of destruction. The Jerome Hayes Foundation had officially launched the previous month, already receiving applications from fraud victims seeking support and guidance. The work was meaningful, but couldn't fill the void left by betrayal and loss. Marcus returned to Door County that evening, driving through darkness toward the estate that had become both refuge and prison. The isolation that had seemed necessary in the immediate aftermath of the arrest now felt like avoidance. He couldn't hide forever. Eventually, he'd need to return to Chicago to resume the business operations he'd been managing remotely, to rebuild a public presence that had been defined by his failed wedding and dramatic trial testimony. But not yet. The trial had drained something essential from him, had required performing strength and credibility while internally processing trauma that felt like it would never fully heal. He needed more time before facing the world that had watched his humiliation play out across news channels and social media. The estate's security system showed a car pulling up the driveway at 10 that night. Marcus checked the cameras, expecting Catherine Morrison with some follow-up question about the trial. Instead, he saw Lorraine Hayes getting out of a rental sedan, a bag slung over her shoulder and determination in her posture. He met her at the door. "Is everything all right?" "I quit my job at the Pinnacle Grand. Told them I was moving to Chicago full-time to run the foundation." Lorraine's smile was tired but genuine.
I was driving back from settling things with my landlord and realized I didn't want to be alone tonight. Didn't want you to be alone either. We both just watched the woman who tried to destroy us go to prison. And that's not the kind of thing you should process in isolation. Marcus stepped back to let her inside, grateful for companionship that understood the complexity of what they'd survived. They sat in the estate's main room, drinking coffee and talking about the foundation's future, about the victims they'd already helped, about the slow process of rebuilding trust after it had been systematically violated. "Do you think you'll ever risk it again?" Lorraine asked as midnight approached. "Letting someone get close? Believing they might care about you for reasons beyond your wealth?" Marcus considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I don't know. Right now, the idea of vulnerability feels like inviting disaster. But I also know isolation isn't sustainable long-term. So maybe, eventually, maybe when enough time has passed that I can separate Sarah's betrayal from the basic human need for connection. Maybe when you meet someone who understands what you survived and doesn't need you to pretend it didn't leave scars." They left the implication hanging between them, neither ready to name it explicitly, but both acknowledging something was shifting in the space they shared. Marcus had known Lorraine for less than 6 months, but they'd been forged together by crisis in ways that created intimacy deeper than years of conventional friendship. Perhaps that was enough foundation to build on. Perhaps the person who'd saved him could also teach him how to trust again. Or perhaps he was just desperate for connection and projecting meaning onto solidarity between survivors. Time would tell which interpretation proved accurate. For now, having Lorraine sleeping in the guest room while Marcus lay awake in his own bed processing the trial's conclusion felt like progress. Small steps toward normalcy. Tiny movements away from the isolation that had felt necessary after Sarah's arrest, but was increasingly unsustainable. The next morning, they walked the shoreline trail together, watching sunrise paint Lake Michigan in shades of gold and rose. Marcus told Lorraine about the letter from his mother, about Thomas Montgomery and the family that had never acknowledged his existence. She listened without judgment, understanding that betrayal came in many forms and damaged trust regardless of underlying intent. "Your mother sounds like she was protecting you the only way she knew how. That's different from Sarah using vulnerability as a weapon. Intent matters even when the impact feels similar." Marcus wanted to believe that distinction was meaningful. He wanted to honor Grace Blackwell's memory by accepting her choices as misguided protection rather than calculated manipulation. But the experience of being deceived felt similar regardless of motive, and reconciling those competing truths would require more time than a single sunrise walk could provide. They returned to Chicago together, Lorraine to begin her work with the foundation, and Marcus to resume managing the business empire he'd built from his mother's sacrifice and Thomas Montgomery's hush money. The city looked different now, colored by knowledge of how close he'd come to losing everything within its boundaries. But it was still home, still the place where Grace had raised him to believe poverty was circumstantial rather than destiny. He could rebuild here, could transform humiliation into purpose and isolation into carefully chosen connection, could honor both his mother's memory and Jerome Hayes's unnecessary death by creating resources that prevented future tragedies, could maybe even learn to trust again, though that particular healing would take longer than the autumn months that stretched